So that is a reminder for me to not go over time and everything. I had a beer yesterday with somebody, and with Rick here, and he said, "What are you going to talk about?" "Oh, well, lability." And he went, "Oh, we use that stuff in Anger. We use it this way and that way, and like this." So I had to change the title a little bit for the expectations of the audience, particularly this guy in front here. So here comes the new title. I hope this is better. I had to change that a little bit. Also, the author of Lability is in the room, so I am not a PowerShell guy at all. I just use PowerShell. I'm a SQL Server guy. And I use PowerShell to make my life easier. I'm a user of PowerShell, not a PowerShell person per se. So I hope you're going to like this. Let's see. I did some talks at the PowerShell conference in Hanover a while back, and of the 3 sessions I did, in 2 of them, Jeffrey Snover walks in, sits in the front, and starts asking questions. So you guys don't scare me at all anymore. I'm not afraid to say I have no clue. I don't know. So don't worry about this. You've seen this before, but I run events as well in the Netherlands. These things are not cheap or free. It's quite expensive to buy coffee for for dozens of your best friends, right? For the whole day, and feed them, and record stuff, and rent places in the middle of London. I'm sure this is not cheap at all. So thank the sponsors. That would be cool. Also, there's beer. In what, about an hour? It's across the street, not very hard to find. So I'll see you there. I've been there yesterday just to make sure that I know exactly where it is. So I'm Dutch, and I used to have a picture here with soccer players, some guys in orange. We don't talk about these guys anymore in the Netherlands. We didn't qualify for the Euro Cup. We might not qualify for the World Cup either. To add insult to injury, the Belgians are the first team that actually qualified of all the European teams. So we might as well be fan of them. It's either them or the Germans, and we have problems. All the Germans in the room? There's a few, right? I heard a German accent before. Thank you. Well, let's not go there. The thing we get sometimes in Holland, where we always go, the Germans are playing really well. Should we support them? No. So we like the German football. We would just never say that out loud. Anyway. So, by the way, this is Max Verstappen. Did you see the last race where he took out 2 Ferraris at once? Yeah. A friend of mine actually really mad at me because I said yay on Twitter, and he started swearing at me. We're friends, so it was all good. The fact that he's Italian might have something to do with it. The fact that he actually works for Ferrari might also have something to do with it. He did not like me at the time. So this is me. Like I said, I'm Dutch. I've been in IT since 1989. No Windows at the time, let alone PowerShell. The SQL Server stuff that I worked with is over 20 years now. And I'm a data platform MVP since, well, it was called SQL Server MVP. That's data platform these days since 2008. And I love not doing things twice by clicking on things. I love automating stuff. So PowerShell, yeah, I kind of like it. That works for me. I've got some unique problems to finish. So here's the thing. You always say you need PowerShell if you have more than X amount of servers or something. How many servers is a thing? When would you start using PowerShell? If you have more than 1, 2 servers? So here's my problem. I've got 1 server. Do I still need PowerShell? Okay. What if I told you that I have 1 database still? 3 tables? This is where people started looking at me funny. You have to. Yeah, this is where people start looking at me funny. Are you a DBA for a database with 3 tables? You're kidding me. No? It's 3 tables.
Set the default value for this question to yes.
Yeah. So it's a funny assignment. It was a proof of concept that went so well that they took it into production right away when they saw the result. They just polished out the proof of concept thing and said, yep, production. It's 3 tables, but it's right now 50 terabytes of data. And I run into things like, okay, the primary key is date time, but it should be date time too, but there's 13 billion rows in the table. How do we do that? So I have a lot of testing stuff, and PowerShell comes in handy here. Now, this is already Lability stuff. Huh. Okay, about Lability, about why I use it. The thing that I do the most, I think like 5, maybe 10 times a day, I need a brand new test environment with a domain controller, 2 SQL servers, a workstation with Management Studio on it that's able to connect to these things. And I would love it if the stuff that I played with yesterday is not on there anymore. So I had, for the longest time, I had stuff where I would have a test environment and cleanup scripts. I think we've all been there, right? My first PowerShell scripts, I hope I'm not the only one here, but my first PowerShell scripts were open it up, change some parameters at the top, save it, run it, right? Not the way you should do this, by the way. But this is how I got started, have cleanup scripts. And then I started using some automation to create these labs. And it's actually not that easy for me, because even though I'm a SQL Server guy and I know stuff around, I can talk to SAN admins or Windows admins or developers. I can yell at them as well. I'm not an Active Directory guy or a networking guy. I keep having trouble setting the right IP addresses and all these things. So I needed either to do it just once and clean it up nicely, which doesn't work, or find a nice way to roll these things out time and time and time again. I've actually tried multiple versions of, there are a lot of tools around there that do that. And the ones I found always had a way to install SQL Server for me, and I wouldn't have to worry about anything. But I'm a DBA. I have my way of installing SQL Server. I worry about these things. I have this in Azure, where you click on, give me a SQL Server on a Windows machine, and the next thing I do is delete SQL Server and reinstall it, because I don't like the way they installed SQL Server. I like my way, right? This is what DBAs are like. We're the ones that say no the whole time, right? So why do I do that? Why do I get a Windows machine in Azure with SQL Server on it and then delete it? Anyone? Licensing, exactly. That's why. So I like the fact that the tool did everything for me, didn't like the fact that the SQL Server was installed in just one way, and I had to go through a lot of PowerShell to figure out where it did that and then change all that. Until I found this nice tool called Lability. And I say tool, but it's a lot of code. And who uses Lability here? Only a few people, okay. Interesting. I'm going to start right at the beginning. Don't worry about that. Who uses DSC? More. That's interesting. I found the best way to learn DSC is by using Lability. It's for me, it's an incredible way to do this. Now I tell you. So, there's one other SQL guy in the room. Sorry, Neil. Now I tell you. Now, so if we start from the beginning, and the beginning is already on this thing. This is where I'll zoom this thing a bit. Oh, the other way. And go here. So, lost me. This is where I tell the thing to not go to presenter mode, stay on the main screen, and still it switches. You gotta love PowerPoint, right? It'll come back. It'll be here. Come on. There we go. So Installing Lability. This is install module Lability, right? I don't have to do this. Already done that. But this is how you install it. Very simple. Let's not go there. But as soon as you've done that, and they've always taught me not to type in a demo, but I'm doing that anyway. There's a whole lot of commands that that probably look familiar, and they make sense, right? Get lab VM, and there's all these. It works with images and defaults and host defaults and statuses, and most of the tools that are around there that make labs for you do this. So where do you start? What do you do, right? Now, yeah, let's see. I've got, there we go. Let's get the defaults. F8. It has a few defaults. And as you can see, for me, it installs stuff on the C drive. For my laptop, this is fine. On your test box, you might want to have some other place, like a D drive or E drive, because the ISOs also go there, and the hard drives, the VHDXs also go there, right? So you want to pick a spot where you have enough space. So only on my laptop, this is on the C drive. It's easy to change, but you want to change that before you get going. Just splat them on there. Set all the. Oh, I shouldn't select it. Makes it harder to read, I think, right? But you take the parameters that you want to change the path of, and you do a set lab host default, and change the defaults. Before you do anything, this is after you've installed it. Then you do the start lab host configuration, which actually creates these directories for you and does a few other things. Amongst which I think even installs Hyper-V if you haven't done that yet, right? I'm looking at you. You're not. I'm fine. Yeah, still not bullshitting. So it's good. he's looking very serious. So far, so good. So you do a start lab host configuration, and it configures everything for you, and then you should be good to go. This is the installation that you can do. So what you can do to test if you're good to go is run a test lab host configuration, make that a little more. Test lab host configuration for Bose. And it tests a few things. If you've got Hyper-V on it, if it has a pending reboot, which on my laptop actually happens quite a lot, and I seem to be rebooting it more than rolling out labs lately, but oh well. You can actually tell it to ignore the pending reboot. I don't do that. I just reboot it. So then you're good to go. Now, let's check. Don't want to be. This thing tells me it's 6 o'clock. That's probably not right. It's 5 o'clock, and I have until 25. Good. So there are a few things that happen next, because there's a few operating systems built in. I have to do this because they're not built in. It doesn't come with operating systems. It just knows where to get them, right? So if you start a configuration, and we'll get to the configurations later, but if you start a configuration that uses one of these operating systems, it will download them automatically from the Microsoft website and you download the ISOs and create disks for you, right? It does that. Of course, they're all evals, obviously, right? So if you want to have your own operating systems in there, you have to put them in there. How do you do that? Well, you use MSDN or whatever you want to use, whatever your choice of getting a legal version of the operating system is. So, speaking of legal, I get these questions a lot. Since I'm from the Netherlands, sorry, can't help you. I've never been in a coffee shop in my life. I don't know how that works. The only thing I do know is we have a smoking ban in public places, which is kind of awkward if you have a coffee shop to run. So we have an amendment to our law that says you are allowed to smoke cannabis in a coffee shop, not normal cigarettes. that would be illegal. So, never mind. So, there is a way to put your own images on there. Register lab media. Now let's not select it so you can see what I'm typing. I've given it an ID. An ID is the stuff you see here on the left, is how you know which media to put in your scripts to use for your labs. I've typed core, which is a stupid name. It doesn't tell me if it's Enterprise Edition. It doesn't tell me anything. So you should use a sensible name so you can see exactly. This is Windows Server 16, 2016, x64, Enterprise or Data Center or Standard or whatever you have, right? It's your naming convention, but find one that works for you so you know what it is. Since we're not downloading it, and the version I've used before needed the URI in there, still does?
Still does, but normally you put file code on it, so you don't have to know it.
Ah, cool. I'm already putting the ISO in the right place, so you don't even need the to download anymore. So I just put a fake URI in there, but you can put the file there. So I just put HTTP blah blah. It doesn't exist, obviously. And then in the end, this is an important one, and I've struggled with that a bit because that's just me. I'm not a Windows Server guy, like I said, SQL Server guy. There is the file name, which is just the file name, not the location. It goes into those default files, default locations that you had before. So you do C Lability ISO, that's where you put it, and put just the file name in there. And there's an even more important one when you get started. It's this one, image name. This needs to be correct because a lot of ISOs have multiple images, right? And I feel like I'm like this is all Windows admins and they go, yeah, of course. Duh. And I'm like, there are multiple images. Everybody's looking at me like, yeah. So actually the, does it switch again? No. So if you Google for how to find these image names, you get the one on the right. You get this one that shows up multiple times before you get the one on the left, and the command is not even there. You can't even see it. But I think I have it in the script. But it's not a PowerShell command, and it will show you these names here: Windows Server 2016 Data Center. And I've used that a couple of times. And then it doesn't work. And Lability goes all the way through, okay, let's create a disk and start installing the OS. And the OS doesn't exist, so I'm installing nothing. Then I'm creating a VM, and I'm done. Oh, and here's an error message that I couldn't find the OS on the CD. And you start your VM, and of course it tries to pixie boot because there's no OS on the disk. You go, okay. It's really forgiving when that happens. Just delete your VM, go to the disks in the directory, delete the disk, get the name right, and try again, right? So the other one, that one works. Get Windows image. So you mount the ISO, and you just do get Windows image, path of the ISO, the drive letter of the ISO, sources, install.wim, and it gives you the options. And these are the names that you need. Like Windows Server 2016, Server Data Center. Slightly different from these, right? These ones work, these ones don't. That was hurdle number one for me. Okay, how do I get those? So, is there another one? Yeah. Now, I can't demo that because it would take too long. But once you've created a configuration, and you created your disk, you've created your configuration, it will look at the configuration in a bit, and you started it, it will see that there is no disk, and it will start creating it for you. So it will create an image for you that it can use. That takes a while, so I'm not going to show it. But if it has done that once, and you're using the same image to create another VM, it won't do that again, right? It would create differencing disks, nice and quick. So you only go through this process once. Also, when you pick one of these eval versions, it starts to download it. It takes even longer, right? Only once, no need to be worried about the time it takes. Now, once you've done that, you need to create a file that tells you what you want to do. So there's two of them that you need. PSD1 and a PS1, because this is DSC. And if you have used DSC, it will look all familiar except for a few parts. If you haven't used DSC, don't worry, I'm not a DSC expert either. And I got through this. You've seen me struggle with the name of the server already, so that may not mean much that I figured it out. The PSD1 has basically all the variables, if you will. It has all the information that it needs to create your lab. So I've got some information here, all the default information for all the nodes, like the what have we? Like the domain name, or which switch to use, what the startup memory should be. And as you can see, there's a few of them that start with lability underscore. These are not used by DSC, these are used by Lability to create your VMs. So the DSC ones create the files that it will inject into your VMs, and when the VM starts, it starts configuring itself with DSC, but the Lability stuff is used by Lability to create your VMs. It does that in one go, right? So I'm assuming Lability uses the Lability underscore stuff, and the DSC part just ignores the fact that these things are there. It doesn't hurt them anyway, right? They show up in the MOF files, I guess, or not at all, not even that. Huh?
They're metadata, so everything in there doesn't end up.
Oh yeah, you're not using it in the other one. Exactly. Okay. What do I mean with the other one? Well, this nice segue. The other one. So the second part you need is a configuration file. This is the actual DSC stuff that creates the DSC, the MOF file, and the file for the LCM, and I'll show you in a bit what that does. But basically here, you're creating a configuration. This configuration is called SQL Lab, and the code that you go through uses the information from the PSD file. As you can see, for instance, for node, all nodes where true node name, basically for anything that it can find, for everything that you specified, set the local configuration manager. For those of you that don't use DSC, the local configuration manager, the LCM, is the thing on the machine, on the VM that you create, or on the Windows host or whatever, that executes the DSC resource. And this is where you specify what it does, because there are a few settings. Reboot if needed. Do I need to explain that? And there's a few things here. Configuration mode, apply only. This just means apply whatever is in the MOF file, and then stop. You can also set it to check every 15 minutes and try to reapply if it starts drifting, right? This might sound like something useful if you have like a website or something. If you have a SQL server with multiple terabytes of data attached to it, do not try to repair this thing every 15 minutes, please. Thank you. That would be to leave my SQL server alone. Right? At every PowerShell conference, we should treat our servers like cattle and not like pets. Well, mine is a pet. Thank you very much. I might have created it with this, but then you leave it alone, right? I've actually had a discussion with a developer that said, no, we can roll it out every time and we'll just restore your database. It's 50 terabytes. You won't just restore it. Come on. Anyway. So there's a few more things that you can set. For instance, where are we? Here's one. And this is the cool part. There are a few sample files that you can take. And I just take those and I copy, paste, and delete, and I just borrow from it. It works perfectly for me. For instance, here, there's the part that just does the domain controller setup. I never touch that because it works nicely. So it sets up the domain controller, and there's also a part that grabs all the other machines that you have specified. Basically, it says, give me all the machines that are not the domain controller, and attach them to the domain. Perfect. That's exactly what I need. Now, what it also does, let's see, is that here? Domain controller. There we go. Further on, further on. Here I have, yes. Here's one that I made. Just by copy pasting and trying to figure this out. You just take the resources, these resources here, and I don't know if you've ever seen that, but sometimes they start with an X, and sometimes they start with a C, and it might be important which parameters you use. And sometimes that changes as well. So this is the cool part here with DSC. It's pretty easy to figure out. If I delete one, it immediately sees that and warns me, like, hey, this one actually needs the instance name. You need to put that in. So I just look at the documentation, go from there, and then when the documentation happens to be not completely correct, which sometimes happens, I just figure it out this way. Make sure I have everything. There is a few more things that you need to take care of. Like, I have these import DSC resources in the top that I need to make sure that all these resources are there. Here's the thing that I'm trying to wrap my head around. As soon as I run this, it will create these MOF files for me, for these servers. It uses the DSC resources that I have on my machine. So I need to have this installed before I run this, before it even can parse these things. I will get errors if it doesn't. Now, if you then roll out your server, it grabs resources from a different location. It doesn't grab them from my modules directory. There might be the case, I don't know if this is still the case, that the versions are different. And that might break your code. The MOF wouldn't run. So you need to make sure that what you specify all the way at the bottom of the other one, never mind, here, what you specify here is what you have installed. You can already see that I cheated a bit. I just did SQL Server. I didn't specify a required version. That is going to come back and bite me at some point. That will happen, already did, will do again if I don't change it. Because, let's see, let's start this. Can you guess what the C means if you have resources? Community, exactly. So the X? Experimental, exactly. Does that mean they are not really finished and they're not really good? The jury is still out on that. What the intended meaning behind it is that the interface might change. You might have breaking changes in the interface with new versions. That's what they mean with that. So if you use anything with an X, probably okay to run in production, test it first, but the interface might change with a new version. So you need to have a good test setup. That's what the X is for. Now, let's go back here. So make sure you have these DHCP resources. And there's a few more things that you have to, you can actually ignore, but I've got them in here anyway. So there's things that I, like for instance, you see that I'm switching on the firewall here. There's a special SQL Server firewall thing, not the Firewall DSC resource, but a SQL Server Firewall DSC resource that only knows about the SQL Server firewall stuff. For people that don't know that, SQL Server uses port 1433 if you have a default instance installed. There's these things. Depends on. This is where you set the dependency between the DSC resources. So the firewall you can only set if SQL Server is installed, which is the worst example ever because that's the actual one thing that's not true at all. You can set a firewall if SQL Server is not installed. That doesn't make any sense. But there's others, like you can, above there, let's get a better example. SQL Server TCPIP, set TCPIP on for SQL Server. If you do a default installation, it doesn't speak TCPIP, so you need to switch that on. And that depends on if SQL Server is installed. Now this does make sense. Now, what about the dependencies between the machines, right? How do you wait for the Active Directory to be there before you try to connect to the Active Directory? Or all these things that are dependent on each other. How does that work? Well, here's the trick. You don't. You just don't. This is the cool part. And it took me a while to figure this out because I ran into these dependencies and I thought, okay, I need to set these dependencies because else it won't work. And then I thought, wait a minute, how does it know? Because I didn't see any dependencies between servers. How does it know? Because there's special DSC resources that you can set to wait for dependencies from other machines to be finished. There's a special DSC resource for that, but it doesn't use those. So let's show you that once you've rolled it out. It's a really cool trick. Oh, this one is running. Okay, I've got my domain controller running. Connect here. No, full screen, come on. Yes, that way. Down here. There we go. View, full screen. Incorrect. There we go. Inside one of these machines is a bootstrap directory that we'll run through. There's a log file that you can check, but let's do the bootstrap file. Make that bigger. This is the resource that gets injected by Lability, and this is what it runs. It's not a resource. This is the PowerShell file that gets injected by Lability, and this is what it runs when it boots to fire off the DSC, to say, hey, okay, start this configuration. All the way in the bottom, well, let's do it here. Is it here? There's even some swearing in there. I love it. Here you go. Replay the configuration until it bloody well helps, right? Until it works. Can I say this on camera? Oh, already did. What it does is it just tries and tries and tries again. It will just go through it. Doesn't work, try it again. Doesn't work, try it again. Doesn't work, until it does it 10 times, then it unloads the whole thing. Loads it again, tries again. So it will just keep on running until it works. This is perfect if you have your DSC scripts in order, right? If they don't, if you have an error, it will just keep on running forever and ever. Or in my case, until the battery runs out. So if you're thinking, it takes a long time for this thing to finish, that might be the case. So if you're working on your DSC skills and your script is not finished yet, a thing that you might want to do is create the config files. Let's create these things, show you. Because if I just run, where is it? Here. The other day I had to do a demo, and I said to the audience, let's zoom in here so you can see it correctly. But I forgot my reading glasses, and I actually zoomed in for myself. I couldn't. The audience could read fine. I couldn't. So what this does in the end of this file is save the configuration data. So if I run this thing, it asks me for a password. Let me type that. You can load this from a file if you want to. If you save the credentials somewhere, you can do this yourself. But at some point, if this laptop wakes up, brand new installed Dell thing, so I can't switch it into high yet. That's not a standard option. You change the registry key before that works. But these configuration files come out, And this is what the what Lability uses to install. You don't have to create this all the time. If you've created them once and you start the lab configuration, you can reuse these if you want to. I just create them again all the time, so I don't have to remember if I change them or not. So just recreate them. And I'll get to the PowerShell thing. So if I now do, let's do this a bit higher up here. Start, lab, configuration data, and you can just point it to the directory with the configurations. So the SQL one that I had, was it the SQL one? Yeah. SQL lab to the PSD one. You point it to the D file. That's what you point it to. Then it reads that and it starts creating those labs. So it creates the disks if it needs to, doesn't if it already did that, creates the VMs based on the information that is in the PSD1 file, the Lability underscore stuff, then injects the MOF files into it, injects other stuff that you want. I'll show you in a bit. I inject a SQL Server ISO and I start a SQL Server installation in it. I have one with a workstation where I install Management Studio. I just inject that and start an installation. It's really simple to do with DSC actually. I've got 25, yeah, 6 more minutes, good. So this is what actually does that. You start this and it starts running. Now, I can do that later, but I'll show you now first what you can do if you have a configuration that you've been playing around with and you're not completely sure about all these settings in your DSC file and it doesn't seem to work, right? You start it up and it just keeps on running, so there's probably something going on. Take them out or quote them out, create more files that are simpler, that you know it will work, create the machines so they exist and it runs fine to completion, then run this again, take the MOF file, copy it to the machine, start the PS1, look at the output, right? You'll get an error message, some manual stuff in there. This is developing, right? Until you get it right, and then you can automate it. Then that part works. So if you add 6 configurations in this thing and it doesn't work, chop it up into little pieces, work on it until it does, and then continue. Lability is really forgiving, so if you don't get the order right, doesn't matter. This is I like this system, but for debugging you have to do some manual stuff. Is there any other way to do this, or?
Well, you got the bootstrap and the log file, so if it sits there and the screen is whirling around, then you got the log file on the machine. But if it joins the domain, reboots, and then DSC carries on, you're at DSC at that point. Event logs, so you're troubleshooting DSC.
Yeah, and troubleshooting DSC is fun. Yes.
This is just DSC. This is generating the MOF file. There's nothing to do with Lability.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And this is also the main reason why I use Lability. It is all built on DSC. So the other tool that I used before, I won't name it because it's a really good tool, but it had everything built in. And this has a lot of plumbing around DSC. And if something is not built in, doesn't matter, it's based on DSC. I can get it to work if there's a DSC resource that would support it, or there's a failback. Where's my workstation? Here's my workstation. There's something called a package. This is a DSC resource. That will just install a set, like an MSI or an executable or a setup. I can always fake it. If the SQL Server setup doesn't do it the way I want it because certain parameters are not supported, and I've ran into 3 or 4 of them already, then just use this. Right? I always get to do it the way I want. And as a geek, I like that, right? And just wait until the resource is ready and then replace it, because you want to get rid of your stuff that you've worked around at some point. But this works for me. And as far as the Management Studio goes, there is no DSC resource for it, so I have to install it this way. Now, how do you get these things in there? No, this one. I have resources in a special ability part, the non-node data. I'm kicking stuff here, where I put Management Studio and SQL Server 2016 ISO in there. So the Management Studio just gets copied to the machine that I want it copied to in the install directory. The ISO, I need it unzipped, unpacked. What do you want to call it? So just say expand this through. It takes the ISO, loads it into the machine, and then with the DSC resource, I can just start the setup. Really clean way of doing this. I like this. Now, in the config, because this is just the resource, here you go. I've got SQL 1, SQL 2, they all use their SQL Server 2016 resource, and then there is node name WS workstation that installs Management Studio. And then in my SQL lab.ps1, the package to install Management Studio on all the nodes that have the role workstation. And for the SQL Server, it's below, I just use X SQL Server setup because I have a really simple setup in this case. I think this is a really clean way. It inserts anything you want and then use DSC to install it. Perfect. Now, I've got 1 minute left. How do I time these things? So do I have... Now, before we get to questions, I've got one important slide that you may have seen already, but there's drinks across the street. Follow me if you don't know where it is. But there's first half-hour session here, the closing out. Any questions? And you can go as deep as you want because the guy who wrote it is in the room. So, yes.
If you're copying resources to the machine like the ISO or the package manager, does it have to be in a particular folder?
Yes, good question. It does. Let me show you. Lability Resources. We set that up in the beginning, remember? When we set the defaults, there's an ISO folder, there's a resources folder, so it needs to be in here. That's where you put it. You can have this anywhere you want, but it has to be in that folder. Yes?
If your lab's too big to fit on your laptop, can you use Amazon or Azure or cloud?
Yes, you can. So for the recording, if your lab is too big to fit on your laptop, can you use Amazon or Azure? I'm not sure about Amazon, but Azure for sure has now virtual servers that have Hyper-V switched on inside the virtual server. So you can use a Windows Server 2016 with Hyper-V on and run. That's the one I meant, yes, nested virtualization in Hyper-V. I've got machines in Hyper-V that are 64 gigs of memory, 8 cores, and just go away. If it's full, create another one. Don't forget to switch it off when you don't need it anymore. It can be quite expensive.
Sorry, just a button. If you're on it about Azure, speak to Rick because he's done a lot of using Lability locally. I can't see.
We use one single set of DSC. So we use this stuff in absolute anger. So we've got different config files for lots of different machine roles, which we then combine into environments for our dev projects. But we've written the desired state config that we can use in the Lability deployed VM so that we can also use it in an Azure Stack or an Azure VM. So in the same project, we've got Lability PSD1 environment files and ARM templates, and I can just throw the whole lot in any direction I like on my workstation, on a lab server, or in the cloud, and we wire that into our release process. He's a saint. He deserves a knighthood. He's brilliant.
It's okay. To wrap this thing up, don't be afraid of DSC. This is actually a pretty cool way of learning DSC. It's got all the plumbing around it to make that work. Make sure you have the versions of the DSC resources correct that you need, that you have those installed on your machine, because the ones that it uses to create the MOF files is not the same ones that get copied to your machine. Be careful with that one. If you're using the eval versions and not using something that you downloaded yourself, be aware that they switch off after an hour. This surprised me like 10 times before I Googled it. Right? Why did it switch off? Is that a feature? Right? I couldn't find it. Wait a minute, that's a feature of an eval version. It switches off.
Can Can I chip in one thing?
Go for it.
To make your life easier too. So debugging DSC, for those of you that already do it, will know it's a bit of a black art. If you look in C Windows System 32 configuration, there's a folder called configuration status. Every time the DSC runs, it drops out a JSON file and a MOF file, so you can see what's going on and what the errors are. But there's also, help me out, Ian, is it get LCM configuration status? There are two PowerShell. Yeah, one tells you whether it's applying a config or not, basically, but the other one tells you whether it's successfully applied a config. And if you drop that out to a PowerShell object, you can find out which resources are in the desired state, which aren't, and for those that aren't, there's an error message block that tells you exactly what failed.
That's pretty cool. I think I'm out. So one last thing. If you run into a bug or anything, Ian is really helpful on GitHub. So instead of working around it in your own piece of the code, tell him and he will fix it, and he'll fix it quickly. I already noticed this myself. This is how community works. This is really cool. I've actually not demoed the thing itself because you'll just be looking at a verbose output of something and then a VM will appear. I can show you if you want to. But I want to close out with one question. Does Lability seem like something that you would use? Does it seem useful to you? Okay, can I get an applause for the guy who made it, please? Okay, that's me. I'm done. I'm gonna get out of the stage, and I hope you had a great day. Thank you, guys.